talk with us at all?
Out of my way. Move.
My mind is just so drained right now. I can't.
Who are the balloons from?
Okay, anything you can tell us.
The Media Circus. It's become the metaphor of choice for the coverage of the Simpson trial.
What's it like to be an instant celebrity, Caleb?
And it did seem at times that the media had taken the country under the big top and through an electronic funhouse.
There was definitely more of a circus atmosphere than just about any event I've ever covered.
The overkill was mind-boggling right from the very beginning.
OJ is home.
Lines between the tabloid and traditional media blurred further.
The difference between the New York Times and the National Enquirer has gone from this big to this big.
And remaining questions. How should journalists strike the balance between serving the public interest and feeding the public appetite?
People want it, people reading it, people care about it. And I think, journalism, like politics, is a democratic institution.
And I'm inclined to terminate the coverage at this time.
And should there be cameras in court?
Playing around with the dignity of an American courtroom. A courtroom is not, it's not the amphitheater at the Coliseum.
The media and the trial. Is it all too much? Before we go any further, let me show you a crane shot of OJ Simpson's Rockingham estate and the media encampment that was deployed until just about an hour ago on his doorstep. That is, until the police, responding to complaints from neighbors, ordered them to pack up and move on. Somebody else is bound to take note of it, so let me be the first to say it. Yes, that was our camera up there in the crane taking pictures of other cameras. As we begin, in other words, to analyze the sins and excesses of the media tonight, we are not talking about them, we are talking about us. There are many reasons why this case has attracted such ravenous media attention, but the simplest is this. OJ Simpson was famous before he was accused of a double homicide. Now he is doomed to be famous for the rest of his life. That is a dreadful fate which most people who yearn for just a little bit of fame cannot begin to understand. But almost everyone connected with this case has received more attention than he or she bargained for. That is one of the problems with the media. When you seek our attention, it can be difficult to get, but once engaged, it can be even more difficult to discard. To the family of Ron Goldman, that has to rank as one of the lesser burdens of this gruesome year. But it has been, and I'm sure continues to be, one of the burdens, and we'll talk to them about it tonight. Also joining us tonight from the prosecution team, attorney Rockne Harmon, and from the defense team, Barry Scheck, who joins us from New York, as does Newsweek's managing editor, Maynard Parker. Also with us, the presiding judge from the Susan Smith murder case. He banned cameras from his courtroom, in some measure at least, because of what he saw going on in the Simpson trial. And I would like to begin, as I warned you before we went on the air, coming to you, Mrs. Goldman, and you asked me not to beat up on you, not a chance. Not on any occasion, but certainly not tonight. Tonight's the night that you get to beat up on us, if you choose to. I have seen you most often standing next to this man as he was particularly upset about one thing or another, usually trying to put a calming or restraining hand on his shoulder. But you've been there. You've been in the court, you've been outside the court with him, and always, always, always the cameras have been there. The television cameras, the still cameras, the reporters, watching every expression on your face. So now it's your turn to tell me, to tell us, how's it been?
I don't have a problem, I don't think, with the cameras being in the courtroom. I do have a problem with what goes on outside of the courtroom. If there are going to be cameras in the courtroom, I think that there should be a gag order as to what goes on outside of the courtroom. And I think it's important for people to know what goes on in the judicial system. I think that they should be aware, but I think there has to be some stipulations as to what, I think this has really gone too far, and there's been free rein for everybody to speak, and I think this has been a big mistake.
I'm not sure if I understand quite what you have in mind when you talk about a gag order outside the courtroom.
Outside the courtroom, where I think everything that goes on in the courtroom should be public, but I don't think that attorneys should be able to go out and speak and voice their opinions outside of the courtroom. I think everything that goes on in the courtroom is fine, but outside of the courtroom, I don't think that should be a forum for anybody to just say what they want to say, and the attorneys I'm speaking about.
Mr. Goldman, as far as your family is concerned, how do you feel? I'm not even sure I want to say treated, because I'm sure people have tried to be sensitive and treat you with respect, but it must just be dreadful at times to have that horde of us descending on you.
For the most part, I would say, except for perhaps the first day after we learned of Ron's death, other than that day that was just overwhelming for each of us, the media has been exceptionally wonderful to us, decent. There's been a handful of little incidences here and there, but overall we've been treated well. And in good part, I think, as my wife mentioned earlier this evening when we were talking, that it's been an exchange. They've been decent to us, and we've been equally, I think, nice to them.
Let me stop you for a moment, because I suspect that those may be the gentlest things you heard said about the media tonight. And indeed, to give you a sense of what some other people around the country are saying, and some of the criticisms that are made of the media's coverage of the O.J. Simpson trial, let's turn for a moment to my friend and colleague, Jeff Greenfield.
Go ahead, push in on it. Go ahead.
For more than a year, it has been the center of the universe.
Stand by, guys.
A force of nature sweeping aside anything and everything in its path.
Mr. Bailey, what is Miss Lopez? What is Miss Lopez?
Hey, you guys should stay outside the circle.
Hey!
What happened, Carl? What can you tell us? What was the delay all about?
Don't push.
Hey! Have you talked to your mom?
We don't think anybody...
Tears of joy, O.J. Simpson, a free man, being welcomed home.
Now it has the look of a battlefield after the war has ended. And why not? The Simpson case involved the deployment of people and money worthy of a global conflict. Now that it's over, we can ask not just who won and lost, but what was won and lost in this mother and father of all media events. From the moment the outline of this story became clear, a very famous celebrity accused of a horrible crime, there was no doubt about what was going on here.
There's race, there's a sports figure, there's celebrity, there's a criminal justice system, there's Hollywood, there's a movie star, and I think it would be a very strange medium of any sort that didn't want to cover it.
I think it was almost like reading a good book or looking at a good piece of art that made me see several things in a new light. The legal system, lawyers, the race issue, wife battering, the effect of celebrity and money and class in our culture.
There are literally hundreds and hundreds of people that must be listening to the radio or watching our broadcast.
But in an age of total media, a great story is not so much covered as it is smothered. In this hothouse atmosphere, journalism's role as instant history sometimes became instant hysteria.
Everything was bizarre. Everything was so bizarre in this case that there is no one bizarre moment. You enter a flow state of bizarreness, and that becomes your daily existence.
Marianne. Witnesses, family members, friends of family members, anyone remotely connected with the case found themselves under siege. Last spring, the pack pursued a woman believed to be a dismissed juror. They surrounded her and would not release her until she proved she wasn't a juror.
My name is Gina Mose. It's an uncommon name. I'm not the one.
Can you talk about this? Tell us real
Way. Move.
Sometime later, another dismissed juror was so hounded, she wound up in the hospital. As the search for metaphors widened, with Feeding Frenzy and Media Circus leading the way, we were told again and again that nothing like this had ever happened before. Well, in fact, it has happened before, just never so much of it. big trials have been entertainment since the dawn of the mass media. For instance, when the accused kidnapper-murderer of the Lindbergh baby went on trial in 1935...
Outside, the crowd was always waiting. 60,000 sightseers in one weekend. Jurors found themselves celebrities as they shut...
So what's different now?
In this story, you have the New York Times next to the National Enquirer, ABC News sitting next to Inside Edition. Everybody's covering this story.
In the Simpson case, the establishment mainstream press found itself competing not just with so-called tabloid media, but with a whole new guerrilla army of cable networks that could directly target the trial buffs. 3 different cable networks covered the trial live every day. On his cable show, for instance, Geraldo Rivera devoted every show, every night, to the case.
To use the analogy to Nightline, that was our America held hostage. That was going to be our defining program. We were going to be the program of record in this tiny little cable universe.
One of the few shows to resist the story was 60 Minutes, the show that first demonstrated how a news program could use the techniques of drama to draw huge audiences.
The box office smash in television this year is Who Killed Nicole? It wasn't too long ago that the box office smash was Who Killed JR? And I'm not sure that if you put them in the same format, that is with a title and music and commercial interruptions and credits at the end, there are guys out there and they don't know the difference between Who Killed JR and Who Killed Nicole.
Meanwhile, critics asked what stories were going uncovered.
When a news president runs through a newsroom and says, I want an OJ segment on every show, whether there's news or not, that's overkill, and that's a lack of self-control, and that's commerce driving the industry.
Mr. Simpson, would you please stand and face the jury?
But did the public regard it as overkill? Hardly. In fact, the case became our national water cooler conversation, our shared frame of reference, the proper subject for humor and satire on mainstream TV. It revealed once again that there is a primal appetite for such real-life drama, an appetite a wider and wider part of the media are more and more eager to feed.
Jeff Greenfield and Francine Florio-Bunton, I'd like to turn to you. You are a former juror on the O.J. Simpson trial. I gather you were not altogether happy with me and my colleagues in the way that we covered you.
No, I thought it was very intrusive in my life.
Talk about it.
Well, I know early on there was some comments made in the press about me, about a 38-year-old phone company worker, and it was coming from an ex-dismissed juror, and this very much upset my family. And, you know, I went through some, and I was very vulnerable. Being a sequestered juror, I couldn't protect myself, I couldn't defend myself, and these comments went unchecked. And it wasn't until I was able to come out publicly, make public statements, and have people see me for really who I am that I feel I've kind of vindicated myself.
All right, but that vindication as well as the vilification, I think you'd have to agree,
comes from the media.
Comes from the media.
Right.
So as you look at how you were treated by the media, if I put it in terms of fairness or unfairness, do you have any feelings?
Well, I would have rather have not been a public figure. I would have rather have been an anonymous juror. I would have rather have just done my job, my civic duty, and then gone home. I didn't want to capitalize on the justice system. You know, excuse me, but I didn't want to write a book. I think I think it's almost heinous to you know, sit as a juror and you know, somehow this is our justice system.
You're sitting next to Tracy Kennedy, another dismissed juror. Did you write a book?
Yes, I did.
Why?
Some things happened to me, and I was affected in some very serious ways that I thought people should know what this does to people when they're sequestered and treated not like regular human beings.
All right, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, I promise you there will be some tougher points of view expressed about us and how we have treated this entire case. Back in a moment. And I would like to take this opportunity now to give two of the attorneys who have been active in this trial an opportunity to express their point of view about media coverage, in what respects they feel it has been helpful or harmful. Barry Scheck in New York, why don't we begin with you?
Well, I was very troubled
by the coverage of this trial. And I'm not talking strictly about the issue of cameras in the courtroom. I'm talking about the coverage. Everything that was said in your setup piece about the line between the New York Times and tabloid television merging and network coverage merging, I think is quite true. What we found often during the course of the trial is that conflict, which is the staple of television, was emphasized over substance. Style over substance. Image over ideas. And I found, much to my amazement, many days when I'd returned from court, when we made the mistake of actually watching television, that sometimes the media was covering the petty disputes between lawyers or the kinds of things that judges ordinarily say to lawyers in the heat of battle, rather than the substance of the testimony that day. And I found it very, very troubling. Finally, I would say that one of the things that everybody had always claimed about cameras in the courtroom was that it really wouldn't affect your ability to bring forward witnesses. And I'd be curious to see what Mr. Harmon thinks, but I know for a fact, from the defense point of view, we had great difficulty getting witnesses to come forward because they simply didn't want to be a part of this. And I think it was a very, very disturbing phenomenon.
Rockne Harmon is a member, or was a member, of the prosecution team. Why don't you pick up on Mr. Scheck's question to you? What did you find in trying to get witnesses to come forward?
I guess it depended on how confident they felt that they were telling the truth. I mean, that may have been the dividing line. That may not rub people the right way, but I think I'd like to just step back to your original question, and that is cameras in the courtroom or the media coverage.
Actually, we're going to get to the issue. Yeah, we're going to get to the issue of cameras in the courtroom separately, and Jeff Greenfield has another setup piece for that. So I'd sort of like to talk to you, or hear you talk to the issue of how damaging you found it to be, or how helpful in some instances.
Well, it's helpful. As a prosecutor, and I've been a prosecutor for 21 years, most of our trials go totally unnoticed, empty courtrooms. And so it's nice, on the one hand, that the public can see how the system works or it doesn't work. Unfortunately, some people often have to pay great sacrifices before others realize that the system doesn't work or needs a change. And I think this is, unfortunately, what we're seeing now at the expense of the Goldmans and the Browns, that the system may not work as well as everybody thought it did.
But is that a function of the media coverage that this particular trial got, or at least sort of weigh for me what kind of a role or what kind of a burden you think the media bears in that regard?
That aspect of the media coverage, I think, is the positive side. It's definitely the positive side. Nothing that we do should we be ashamed of having the public view. And I think the other side of the media coverage is the idea of the effect of this coverage on people's behavior in the courtroom. And I'd be the first to agree that I don't think that it had a positive effect on the way most people behaved. I'm sure some sociologists will do studies on this case someday, and the same ones that study animals at the zoo, and they'll tell us some conclusions that they've drawn from the effect of cameras on behavior.
Dennis Prager is a talk show host here in Los Angeles. You made a decision early on not to talk about the O.J. Simpson trial.
And in fact, I was attacked for it in a piece in a local newspaper. Who's Prager to tell people what's important? But the fact is that we in the media do decide what's important. I didn't think that it deserved the attention that it had.
Why not? Hell of a story. I mean, you can't argue that this is one of the most riveting stories to come down the pike in many years.
Yeah, riveting. Gladiators were riveting in Rome. I'll tell you, an interesting thing happened. I had a woman, since we're being self-critical, I'm with ABC, you're with ABC, a woman from ABC News came into my studio just last week to cover the show for ABC News, and essentially requested that I have a call. It was important to her that I have a call from either an angry black or an angry white. And I said, well, on my show, I try not to have angry callers. And so essentially nothing got covered. It was disappointing for TV that I had nobody yelling at anybody.
Sitting right next to you is Michael Jackson, another talk show and long-standing talk show host in this community.
We don't agree.
I was reading that. I was reading that from your body language, Michael. Maybe
I was
you'd
very
like
angered by something I just heard and something I remembered.
Put it into English for us.
Okay, Dennis, throughout the trial, you said categorically he's a murderer. I don't think you have the right to do that. Said it over and over again.
Well, the ACLU took out an ad the day after the video came out about the Rodney King beating and said that the police were guilty. I don't recall Michael attacking the ACLU for making that judgment immediately.
They were not going to be executed or put behind bars, depending.
Well, I didn't make that judgment until the evidence seemed to me from Marsha Clark's opening statements and the lack, I felt, of a good defense to be overwhelming. And I still feel it's overwhelming, and most of the country does.
Jeffrey Toobin, you wrote a seminal piece for the New Yorker early on in which you revealed, I think for the first time, that the defense was going to go after a Los Angeles detective by the name of Mark Furman, and you suggested for the first time that race was definitely going to become an issue, at least his racism was going to become an issue. Incidentally, I gather he dropped his libel suit against you today, is that right?
I noticed that, yes.
Yeah. Talk for a moment about, we've been talking about radio, we've been talking about television. Talk about the print medium, newspapers, magazines.
I think race is an issue that forces reporters, more than anything else, to worry about not giving offense. I think we are paralyzed on the subject by and large, and it seems to me sometimes that we concentrate on balance to the exclusion of truth.
And your conclusion is?
Well, is that I think coverage suffered. I think sometimes arguments on one side or the other were absurd, and we treated them as if they were balanced. I mean, F. Lee Bailey suggested, for example, that that there were in fact two murderers and one carried the other because of the footprint. That's why there was only one set of footprints. Now, I don't think it's a reporter's obligation to report that as one theory and the one killer as another theory.
Point well taken, but if I may make another point, this is going to be an evening when we don't criticize either the prosecution or the defense. They get a chance to do it to us, as will a number of other people here, and I invite some of you, when we come back, we're going to hear from Jeff Greenfield again, then I invite some of you to come to the microphones here and participate in the dialogue. We'll be back in just a moment. We have already touched on a few of the issues that we want to address in greater depth later in this program, but to lay out some of the remaining ones, I turn once again to ABC News' Jeff Greenfield.
A lot of the arguments about the coverage of the Simpson case involve some very traditional issues. High media road versus low media road. Wretched excess. Too much of a good or bad thing.
This is the first time where journalism's hypocrisy has really been shaken out of the bushes, where the difference between the New York Times and the National Enquirer has gone from this big to this big.
But the Simpson case coverage also raised two other critical issues. First, what did the quality and quantity of coverage do to the criminal justice system? And second, how did the media deal with the enduring American dilemma of race?
I'm concerned that both attorneys from both sides have referred to what other people around this country may think. That causes me to believe that the lawyers are pandering to the cameras.
I think the constant eye of the camera in the courtroom was what really drove a lot of what went on inside the courtroom and outside. I think if it was back in the old days before television, it wouldn't have been quite so crazy.
I think that this trial, more than any other, was a video trial, because we saw in the presentation of evidence the media becoming part of the evidence in witness after witness after witness. On direct examination and in impeachment testimony, news clips were used to bolster or to tear apart a witness's testimony.
But there may have been a much more direct media impact.
What did you see, ma'am?
Jill Shively claims to have seen an agitated O.J. Simpson racing back toward his home the night of the murders. But because she had been paid to tell her story on hard copy, the prosecution never called her to the stand. More broadly, the effect of the TV coverage was to create two very different trials, one inside the courtroom, one outside.
You're actually witnessing yourself the live testimony that's taking place. So it makes everyone a lawyer. It makes everyone a judge. Everybody. This was a jury of millions and hundreds of millions of people on this case.
What's your verdict? Is O.J. Simpson guilty or innocent?
The courtroom is not, it's not the amphitheater at the Coliseum. You don't go there to go thumbs up or thumbs down on, you know, throw them to the lions, nah, let them go. That's what it's become. Television is the Coliseum.
One clear result of cameras in this courtroom is that it turned the case into America's favorite spectator sport, with instant analysis right out of the broadcast booth.
I think that we saw Christopher Darden give a more dynamic performance,
I think that Johnny Cochran, in his appeal to the jury, was appealing to them on several levels.
One of the things about Johnny Cochran is he always sounds good, even when he's talking trash.
This is the first time that I can remember in the history of this country where there is a national consciousness about the quality of judges and the quality of lawyers in important cases. I think that's a terrific thing.
Race plays a part of everything in America.
The trial also produced a national debate about race and the criminal justice system, an issue that first emerged when Time magazine darkened Simpson's mugshot photo for its cover.
You do not have people who look like me who are helping to make those decisions. If there had been someone in the Time suite who looked at that and went, guys, there might be a problem with this, and let me tell you why, they would have taken a lot less guff for it.
Media critic John Katz has a different spin on the question of race. In a comment made before the verdict came down, he blamed media's timidity for not confronting the race issue directly enough.
I think most people, most journalists covering the trial that I've talked to, believe very strongly that O.J. Simpson is guilty. And they believe that he's not going to be convicted primarily because of racial considerations influencing the jury. That has not been the voice they're allowed to express to the many, many people watching their broadcasts and reading their accounts.
It is entirely possible, of course, that had the media somehow been barred from covering this trial, the outcome would have been no different. Wealthy defendants have always had a much better chance at raising reasonable doubts than impoverished ones, and jury verdicts have been controversial for centuries. But this case gave tens of millions of us an unprecedented close-up look at both high-profile criminal justice and high-profile journalism. But how happy are we with what we have seen and learned? I'm Jeff Greenfield for Viewpoint in Los Angeles.
Judge William Howard presided over the Susan Smith murder case, and Judge Howard, we're happy to have you with us. The reason we invited you is because of a decision you took early on. You decided not to permit cameras into your courtroom, and I'd like you to tell us why.
Well, to begin, of course, our decision was made as the O.J. Simpson case was in progress, or my decision. It was made after the motion by defense counsel, and as I heard some of the comments earlier, the decision really was made on the basis of what was first, I think, set forth in the case of an old case, Billy Saul Estes versus the state of Texas, where many of these very same criticisms or points were raised and talked about, such as the impact on the jurors, the fact that even if they don't see the camera, there's a special weight or an extra weight with the knowledge that this case has that kind of notoriety. The amount of time spent with attorneys picking every statement so carefully because they're on national TV.
You think this trial would have been significantly shorter if there had been no camera in the courtroom?
I can tell you my experience was that when we removed the cameras from the courtroom, the remaining proceedings went more smoothly and much more quickly. People were not afraid to stop in mid-sentence if it wasn't coming out the way they wanted it to come out and start over again. They weren't picking every word so carefully. And they didn't have to go home at night and see themselves critiqued by everybody across the country with the impact that that has on them. And I think that that plays an important role in the process as well. And I think all of that can lower the dignity of the judicial system and have that impact.
Speaking of lowering dignity, we're going to have to take a commercial break in a moment. But before we do, I would just like to get you expressed your viewpoint in your own court. How do you feel about the general subject of cameras in the courtroom? Would you exclude them categorically?
In the normal case where there's a 30-second sound bite that's not being used for anything other than as a background, I don't think they have an impact. I don't think they aid. And I would like to make the point that the Supreme Court has said very clearly that a person who's on trial has an absolute right to a fair and impartial trial. And unless you can show me that those cameras in some way aid that, then if there's a question about it, as a judge, it's my duty, I think, to exclude them.
You raise an excellent question. It's the first one we'll address when we come back, but we're going to take a break right now.
Ready to jump in?
I'm concerned that both attorneys from both sides have referred to what other people around this country may think. That causes me to believe that the lawyers are pandering to the cameras, and that causes me to believe that probably I ought to pull the plug on the cameras. I'm contemplating doing that. So I'm tired of this kind of argument.
He did. He contemplated it, and a couple of times he even did it very briefly, but by and large the cameras remained in the O.J. Simpson case throughout. I want to go to just a few members of our audience here before we go to some of our expert panelists. Go ahead, sir, and if you would make your comments relatively brief.
Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. My name is David Glassman. I'm a prosecutor here in Los Angeles. I'm also on the faculty of a local law school. And the reason that this case, I think, has renewed the debate in televised trials is that this trial was not merely televised, it was presented as a television production. So while the trial remained the same, regardless of where one watched it, what the various networks competed for was the theme music, the best analysts, and the most pithy commentary, much of which I submit was inaccurate and all of which was highly opinionated. And while this trial has been very good for business, for many of the people that are among your guests tonight, it may not have been very good for fairness, particularly in the result, especially because of the way in which issues were constantly inflated and exaggerated.
I'm going to talk to a couple of our other audience members here in a moment, but I think, Fred Graham, that I have to come to you. You and I first got to know each other when you were legal correspondent over at CBS, but more recently you have worked at Court TV. And I think Court TV stands perhaps alone as having given a uniquely sober and complete rendition of this trial. So maybe you want to respond to what this gentleman had to say.
Well, certainly when there was not stirring music strains and, on Court TV, there were guest commentators. Some of them are sitting here. Ermin Chemerinsky sitting across there and others. And they were excellent. And it was done in a way that helped people to understand the process and the judicial system in general. But I think what we're seeing here is a generalized reaction against the media circus, justified, I'm sure, but generated really to a great extent, about the tabloidization of the process outside the camera in the court. And it would be a shame if that generalized revulsion against both the trial and the coverage, I think it's both, but because legally and constitutionally the system can't strike out at the tabloid or at the print press. The only handle that the system can get on the media is the camera in the court. And I think what we've heard here, I can see Rockne Harmon nodding his head because he said, look, there's some things wrong with this process, and we were able to see it. And I think Mr. Goldman would probably agree, I think Ms. Goldman did, that the fact that people really have a view of the real evidence, people around the country. And I think that they get some satisfaction in that. And so it would be a shame if, out of the frustration about some of the things we've seen here, those benefits were sacrificed.
Mr. Goldman, I know you wanted to get a quick comment in.
Yeah, thank you. From where we sit as a family, I can tell you that there were two overwhelming issues that came in play. One was that the cameras and the daily barrage of media coverage created an opportunity for issues to be pushed and entered into this trial on a daily basis and broadcast over media. The courtroom turned into a pulpit for agendas, and what was lost were Ron and Nicole. There were two people brutally murdered, and the trial turned into issues that had nothing specifically to do with this trial. The positive side, if I can loosely refer to it, was that everyone in this country had an opportunity to see everything on a daily basis. And if the letters that our family received are examples of how people felt, they were deeply disturbed and saw something that hurt, that scared enormous numbers of people. They saw a judicial system that was broken, that wasn't working on a daily basis, and those cameras didn't cause it, but they helped create some of the problems. And I don't blame the cameras for the problems. I blame, frankly, I blame attorneys that turned it into a circus. I blame a judge that didn't control it. And when all was said and done, everyone knows what we feel as a family. There wasn't justice. There wasn't justice for Ron and Nicole, and there wasn't justice for this nation. It was turned into a nightmare.
Mr. Goldman, you will understand, I hope. You've said what you had to say, and of course I respect your right to say it, but you also know we are here tonight not to discuss that issue, but to discuss the issue of cameras in the courtroom and how the media has handled the case. A quick up or down if in the future someone came to you and said cameras in the courtroom?
I think I'd probably say no.
Okay.
But I'm glad that they were in to some small degree this time. If not because, if for no other reason than people had an opportunity to see what a nightmare can cause.
Let me turn to the lady up there at microphone D. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Marguerite Downing, and I'm president of Black Women Lawyers of Los Angeles. As a deputy public defender, I'm opposed to cameras in the courtroom. I believe the Constitution guarantees a criminal defendant a fair trial, and I don't think you get one when you have cameras in the courtroom. It also trivializes what the lawyers on both sides do, and without the cameras, I think we wouldn't have had these personal attacks on Johnny Cochran. We wouldn't have worried whether or not Marcia Clark's outfit was appropriate. And I think we got away from the issues that there were two people who had died, and here was somebody charged with the crime, and was there enough evidence to bring back whatever verdict? We got away from that, and so I oppose cameras in the courtroom.
Let me, and if I may, let me ask you to hold your applause or signs of disapproval. We'll get a lot more people on, get a lot more done. Maynard Parker, managing editor of Newsweek magazine, I know you tend to favor cameras in the courtroom. Why?
Absolutely. I basically believe that we're all better off knowing what goes on in our courtrooms rather than not going on. And I think, on balance, the question of whether there was seepage back to the jury on such things as Furman, we don't know entirely at this point what the jury did feel, but the first reports of the jurors, or one or two who have talked, indicate that was not the case, that there wasn't a lot of seepage back. Where I think the cameras, although I certainly favor them in the courtroom, have been divisive in the country as a whole, is that there is one jury, the 12 men and women in the courtroom, and then there's the 150 million at times people who were also jurors watching on the outside. And part of the tactics of the lawyers in the courtroom, such as the putting great stress on Furman, such as Mr. Cochran's closing arguments, clearly, I think he was probably doing what he needed to do as a defense lawyer to use every possible weapon at his disposal to get his defendant off. But that had a whole other effect outside the courtroom, beyond probably what it perhaps had on the jurors. Now, the issue of race got elevated in this at the end of the trial. I happen to think that's not such a bad thing. I happen to believe that race is probably the most important subject in America, and anything that makes people talk about it to one another across racial lines, on balance, is a plus.
I'm curious, actually, that you as a print man would so strenuously defend television's right to be in there, because it seems to me that you've been emphasizing most of all the need of people to get the information out. They get information out whether the cameras are there or not.
Well, the one story that I was an editor on long ago was the Patty Hearst case. In a way, it had many of the same wrappings of this and trappings of this story. It had celebrity, it had crime, it had race, all sorts of things. I think we did 6 or 7 covers during the course of that. And that was without court TV, without CNN, without tabloid television. So this phenomena is one that happens every once in a while. I don't think that means because it happened in the Simpson case that it is therefore going to happen in every case that faces the criminal justice system. And I think therefore we shouldn't make a decision based on the Simpson case.
Let me jump over again to Barry Scheck, who's also in New York. Mr. Scheck?
I think you're missing the point here. Mr. Glassman, the district attorney who spoke from the audience, was on the money. The problem here is the way this particular trial was covered by the networks and the tabloid networks. That was the problem. It's not court television. Court TV, where I worked with Fred Graham from the very beginning, is very, very careful in the way the commentators are trained, the way they're informed. There's an effort not to do an instant analysis after every day that sort of tells you who's ahead, who's behind, in a fashion that causes people to make prejudgments. Instant analysis, which is the staple of television and this new industry of pundits, is antithetical to the orderly unfolding of evidence in court. Take Mr. Prager. He said he made up his mind after the opening statements. That's not the way a jury is supposed to evaluate a case. You're supposed to wait for the defense side of it, too. You're supposed to wait for all the evidence. And I think what happened in this case is that the pundits told the people what they were supposed to think, and lots of people forgot the evidence. And they really didn't focus on the substance of the evidence. And I think, frankly, when they heard the defense closing arguments about the hard evidence in this case and the reasonable doubts, I think a lot of people began to say, well, you know, they really didn't prove this case. And if I were sitting as a juror, I'd have to vote not guilty, too.
I'd be the last person in the world, Mr. Scheck, to argue with you about the megaphone effect of television. It has an enormous effect of amplifying everything. But if you did not have television in a courtroom, you would still have the analysts, perhaps in print, but also on television, because they'd still know what was going on in there. You'd still have them talking about it every night.
Ted, you know very well that there's something different about this medium, that we all have to be very careful about it. Otherwise, the public is going to say, get these cameras out of the courtroom. Television focuses on conflict. It focuses on image at the expense sometimes of substance and ideas. You know, the trial is not always so exciting. Sometimes it's kind of dull, and you have to hammer away and make points, both sides, to establish something that will later be pulled together for the jury. And that's not the way television likes it.
I'm not going to let Mr. Goldman speak because his daughter Kim would like to get a word in edgewise here. Go ahead, Kim Goldman.
Like usual, I disagree with Mr. Scheck. I have a problem with he accusing the pundits of telling the people what they ought to be hearing and what they ought to be understanding from the evidence, when you only heard the defense after the day in court attacking the other side and telling them what they should have understood. And well, the prosecution had it all wrong and the witness didn't have it all right, and this is what you should really take from this. The defense I know we're not here to attack each side, but the defense were the only ones every day after court to be getting their point across. And when it didn't get fulfilled inside the court, they took it to the street. For Mr. Scheck to say that he disagrees with the pundits telling you what you ought to be hearing, then he had no business in the parking lot every day telling you what you ought to be hearing. I disagree with him.
Kim, let me step in for just one moment, because I promised Mr. Scheck that one thing that was not going to happen here was going to be him versus the Goldman family.
I don't mean it in that respect at all, but I disagree with the substance of what he is speaking of, regardless of what he did and any other member. And
I understand. But Mr. Scheck, if you don't mind just giving a quick response.
No, I think that she makes a very good point. I think that there should be limitations. Frankly, I think both sides did it, and it doesn't make me happy that during the course of a trial that kind of thing happens. But I think that there was the media itself feeding this. Another point that was made that's a very important one, unlike any trial I've been associated with, and I did represent Hedda Nussbaum, and I did go through the Joel Steinberg murder case, so I've sort of been through something like this before, nothing quite like this. But, you know, the media insinuated itself into every witness and every event every day, and people wound up responding to what was going on there. And I think that we need a code of ethics, essentially, for television commentators and how they're looking at this case, and how they're looking at cases in the future. Otherwise, we're going to lose these cameras.
All right, we're going to take a short break once again. I don't want anyone to think that I have forgotten Geraldo Rivera's comment about the New York Times and the National Enquirer being just like that. Dave Margolick of the New York Times is sitting over there. We'll come to him when we come back. David Margolick of the New York Times and I do not know each other, but we are a pair of what I guess are establishment journalists who have a healthy respect for the men and women of the National Enquirer, at least on this story. They have done well on it. You have acknowledged as much in some of the stories you've written in the Times. I've just finished doing a story on the National Enquirer, which keeps getting bumped because of this story, but I will acknowledge the same in that story. Is what Geraldo Rivera says true? Have we somehow come that much closer to one another, or is it something else?
Well, I think that Geraldo knows that what he says is nonsense. You know, I don't take that terribly seriously. That's just hype. The reason that people are linking my paper in the National Enquirer is that I wasn't so elitist as to pretend they didn't exist. As you know, I mean, they were an important player in this entire story. This is their turf. They put 20 people on this story, you know.
And they did well. They broke some major stories.
And they broke some very important stories. I mean, I find it ironic that the three most memorable words I think I've written in this entire story are the National Enquirer. Somehow, when I mentioned them in the paper, everybody seized upon it. But it seemed to me to be a disservice to my readers to pretend they didn't exist, so I didn't.
All right, well, let's not be so elitist as to pretend, however, that there isn't a little flavor of tabloid in the coverage that we in the regular media have applied to this case, even the great gray New York Times.
Well, I suppose that to some degree the distinction between the mainstream media, I mean, we keep talking about the media is a plural noun, you know, and the print media is very different from the electronic media in this story. We're not the ones banging people's heads with cameras and all of that, and I think that Barry Scheck well knows that when he picked up the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times or Newsweek in the morning, he wasn't seeing personalities and squabbles and this kind of personality-driven journalism. And I think to lump us together with all of that is really quite demeaning and insulting.
Well, all right, let's have a little more insult. Steve Dunleavy, you want to pick up on?
Yeah, I mean, we're taking this all too seriously all around.
Explain your own background a little, would you?
Steve Dunleavy, I've been a journalist for 41, 42 years, and I've been both print reporter and a television reporter. But look, ever since biblical times, trials were public, and suddenly we're getting all bitter and twisted about television cameras in court. All we're doing is making the room bigger. And for Barry Scheck to take any kind of exception to cameras, my God, he never stopped playing to the camera. How about that, Mr. Fung? My God, Barry, please give me a break. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It is ridiculous. The cameras do nothing. I can tell you what, a lot of lawyers are very worried about cameras in court. I've actually been in court where I've seen a judge fall asleep during a very, very important part of the case. And for that young lady, with all respect, to talk about, well, here we wouldn't have these little squabbles, and Johnny Cochran would not be so criticised if it wasn't for cameras in court. I can tell you, as long as Johnny Cochran invokes the name of Adolf Hitler when there is the father of a Jewish victim in court, I don't care if there are cameras in court or not. He'll be excoriated, as he should be.
All right. Mr. Scheck, I guess fairness requires that I give you a chance to respond if you want to.
Well, I'm not going to respond to Mr. Dunleavy, but I will respond to David Margolick because I think he's right. I think there was a big difference between the way the print media covered it and the way the television media covered it, except for Court TV. I think the editorials lately in the New York Times about what happened to the process were on the money, on the issue of race, on the issue of the verdict. I think the written press was far more responsible than the television, news magazines, and the daily round of pundits that you would see on local television.
All right, Richard Reeves, do you want to pick up on this notion?
Well, I want to join David. The New York Times, my alma mater, I think that the comparison is ludicrous. I don't see, though, television as media. Television is an environment. It's like weather. It changes everything it touches. It will now change trials and the criminal justice system as it changed the presidency, as it changed the Congress, as it changed professional football. We'll have 2-minute warnings so they can slip in some commercials during trials. It is a dominating factor. And the question for the media, for us, those of us who write and report for a living, is this: with the hundreds of reporters, hours upon hours of television time, hours upon hours of radio time, what weren't we covering? What would those hundreds of reporters be doing? What don't we know about our country, about the world? Because from top to bottom, people made certain decisions about the kind of glamorousness and spectacle of this trial. We have taken a year of journalism away from the American people.
Well, I mean, you make an interesting point because, in fact, and Jim Moret of CNN, let me turn to you because this has been your story for the last year or more. Fact of the matter is, I think that coverage of the Simpson trial on television was more than or approximately double that of the next most covered story, which I think was Bosnia, but I'm not altogether sure. So what does that say about us?
Well, I have to back up first. And when you talk about television, being in that courtroom to show you the spectacular, I would remind everyone that when we made a commitment to our viewers that we would cover this trial in an extended form, that meant we were there through the dog days of DNA. That meant we were there for the entire month that was consumed by just 2 witnesses, Dennis Fung and Andrea Mazzola. They were not intrinsically exciting, but we made a promise to our viewers. Now, at CNN, we clearly covered that story to the exclusion of others for the portion that we covered this trial live. We are, however, a 24-hour all-news network, unlike ABC, for example, and when we would cover the trial for 8 hours in a given day, there's 16 other hours that we would devote to other coverage. We would also interrupt coverage for breaking news in Bosnia, for the president's speech. So we were very mindful of the fact that there are other things of equal or greater importance happening in the world, and we would often turn to those items.
There was a glorious moment, Jim. Glorious, I'm being facetious. There was a moment a few days ago when closing arguments were in full swing, and the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Israel and the King of Jordan and Yasser Arafat were meeting on the White House lawn, and mercifully for CNN, they took a break in the trial, which enabled you to go to that other event. But when the break was over,
we did not go directly back.
No, it took a few minutes. You're correct.
It took quite a few minutes. We missed at least half an hour or 40 minutes of the coverage. And no, well, that's because that was the duration of a specific event. And I will tell you something, that our viewers called up en masse. Why are you not showing? We can read about this later. We can see this later on tape. This is happening now. We want to see it. We got that time and time again.
I want to turn to one of my bosses, Dick Wald, who is Senior Vice President, Executive Vice President. What's your latest title? You has also been a newspaper editor, was once president of NBC News, has done it all in this business. The differences, the distinctions between print coverage and television coverage, any wise thoughts to take us to a break?
Well, I think that television coverage in general deals better and more with emotion than it does with the details of things. But basically, we all make the same mistake. Barry Scheck, when he has a problem with the lawyers coming out and doing bad things, says, let's draw up a code of ethics for the commentators. When somebody sees something wrong on Inside Edition, let's do something about television. David Margolick says, but the New York Times isn't one of the tabloids. We all see ourselves as being wonderful folks. The truth of the matter is that the people in our collective audiences see us as one thing. The chattering classes have a general sense of eat your porridge control. Don't do this, you should be covering the G7 instead of the Simpson trial, the meeting of financial ministers in Paris. It is all a difference between the way in which you cover a given event, which is individual to different organizations. I think we did a reasonably responsible job in our world. And the perception of people who either like the way it's generally going or don't like the way it's generally going. If they don't like it, it's all terrible. Television is terrible, not the given thing. Print is terrible. They're all tabloid because you don't like the way it's going. If you do like the way it's going, well, they're being very responsible over there. I do not see any great difference in the way in which our coverage has been done between television and print and radio. I see a difference, however, in the perception of some people that they liked one thing and didn't like the other.
All right. You've certainly thrown down a gauntlet here that can be picked up. I trust it will be. I think what we need is a tough, unrelenting, unremitting critic of this industry, and we happen to have one right over there. We'll turn to him in just a moment. Howard Rosenberg is the media critic for the Los Angeles Times. I said he was a tough one. He's also a very thoughtful one. So what are your thoughts at this point, Howard?
I think a good time was had by all. You know, first of all, I think when we're talking about newspapers, I think it's a mistake just to speak of the New York Times or the LA Times as a metaphor for newspapers. I think even though you have to grant Geraldo Rivera his hyperbole, I think the line between tabloids and newspapers is not all that great in the broad scheme of things.
On this story or
on
in
this
general?
story, but I think it's been something that's been happening for a decade. You can't isolate this story. The road to this story goes right through Amy Fisher, lots of other stories, Tanya Harding, Michael Jackson, the Menendez brothers. There's been a steady decline, and this is like the logical, outrageous extension. And what really bothers me, what you really have to do, I think, is really separate the quality of the coverage with the quantity of the coverage. The quality of the coverage has been very uneven, many times, much of it very bad. But the quantity has just been appalling. I mean, of course, this was a big story. It was a good story. It still is a good story, but never, ever to the extent to which it was covered. I mean, you know, this has been sort of a Goodyear blimp that's flown over the country. It's just inflated way out of proportion. I love symbols. I saw one yesterday. Yesterday in Los Angeles, 4 television stations went live to cover a news conference of a juror in this case. 5 minutes after that, the president welcomed the Pope. Nowhere on television except CNN. Today, the Pope addressed the UN. No live coverage of that except on CNN. That's not to say that the Pope in any way has the following of Geraldo Rivera. But to really mix a metaphor, you know, he's not really chopped liver either. So, you know, I'm really pessimistic about where the media are going. I just had this terrible feeling that 20 years from now, things will be so bad that we'll look back at a show like Hard Copy, like we do today, Edward R. Murrow, and say, gee, wasn't that a great show? Why can't we do that today?
Well, let's hope not, but let me turn for a moment to Craig Hume, who is news director of KTLA, which is a local station here in Los Angeles. You carried the Simpson trial live.
Yes, we did.
Did extremely well with it.
It was the top-rated programming in Los Angeles during the course of the trial.
Right, and you or at least you were in danger now of sort of reverting to your former rating status, but you have had an inspiration, I take it.
Well, we found that the public in Los Angeles has a tremendous interest in the legal process, and there are a number of other high-profile cases coming to trial, and we're very interested in continuing with live coverage, at least through part of the day, of many of those trials. The next major trial that is scheduled to begin next week is the retrial of the Menendez brothers, and we plan to be there with a camera in the courtroom, but the judge in that trial right now is considering a motion from one of the defense attorneys to ban the camera. And there have been a number of other cases which have been scheduled to come to trial in the last 3 weeks, many of which we wanted to cover, and the judges in 90% of those cases have ruled to ban the camera. So it's becoming a problem.
Can you understand why?
Certainly, but I think the camera provides the public with an eye into a courtroom. And without that camera, people who want to follow the legal system and a trial have a difficult time doing that.
I just want to go to New York one more time quickly to Maynard Proctor and just ask, I mean, quite clearly, and I'm not placing us apart from or above anyone else. We all have commercial interests, those of us who work for commercial television. But when you hear of KTLA, for example, now considering going to live coverage of the Menendez, somehow I have trouble accepting that as an interest in the judicial system.
But as opposed to what? As running soap opera reruns or something? In other words, I don't see the problem with that. The fact of the matter is, I am not someone who wants to say, because a story is being talked about by everyone in America, people are interested in the story, then my God, we know better. We shouldn't put it on television or into the newspaper or into the magazine.
Maynard,
there is an overkill, I grant you that. But I think that, remember the first days of the New York Times when the story just broke, and you can tell when the New York Times is embarrassed by something because you go searching through the newspaper and there on page 18 they see the story not by one of their staff correspondents, by the AP. And that means they don't know how to handle the story. And all of a sudden, after a while, after about 3 or 4 or 5 days, it began inching out. And so now, of course, during the trial, you had perhaps, I thought, one of the best day-to-day coverage provided by the Times of the trial. It was terrific. But it took them a little while to get in gear.
Let me just warn you parenthetically, watch those nasty comments about the daytime soaps. I made one once and never got more nasty mail in my life. Let me turn to the gentleman up here at microphone E. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, I'm Jack Leon, science teacher at University High School, and I see it from a little different perspective.
Just move over to the mic, would you please?
Okay, I see influenced students, high school students, 15, 16 years old, and they see this trial as what I saw as a football game, basically two sides competing against each other, and they're used to instant gratification. And this worries me to see students that take a polarization as far as this trial, made them very polarized even on racial lines and other lines as well, and that kind of concerns me.
Now, is that a function of their abilities to perceive and process and understand a trial like this, or, do you think it is a problem of the way that the trial was presented?
It's not necessarily the camera in the courtroom. It's a problem of the way it was presented. It was presented as an entertainment, and these people are constantly, I mean, they're the biggest audience of television in this country, and they saw it as something as winners and losers. When it was over, that was it. And if it was presented any other way, they wouldn't take an interest in a trial.
All right, let me bounce across the hall here to the lady at microphone C. Go ahead, ma'am.
Yes, my name is Jamie McConnell, and I'm a second-year law student attending Loyola Law School. And my comment also concerns the media's coverage of the public's reaction to the verdict itself. Like the man just commented, I think that the media really contributed to the racial polarization that we did face. When you look at it, it seems that the media strategically placed cameras in locations where there would be a large group of African Americans viewing the verdict, and another camera where there would be a large group of white Americans viewing the verdict. And then they kind of like spliced the television so that you saw both reactions at the same time.
Yeah, we did that last night on this program, as a matter of fact.
Right, and you just saw the reactions. You didn't really hear why they were reacting that way. You just saw what the reactions were. And I think we need to keep in mind that our society is based on a marketplace of ideas, which means that people should be allowed to express why they feel the way that they feel, not a marketplace of perceptions. And I think that's what the media has done with this trial.
Michael Datcher. The LA Sentinel. Tell me about your newspaper and tell me how you react to what you've just heard from both these people.
It's a black newspaper in Los Angeles. I think it's really important to start talking about how the mainstream press has dealt with this trial and how the black press has dealt with this trial. Essentially, the mainstream press, it's important to talk about who makes decisions about what news is presented. In the mainstream press, primarily white people make decisions about which news is presented, and that news is oftentimes presented through kind of a cultural prism. So, as we've seen throughout the polls on television, for the most part, white people think that OJ Simpson is a guilty man. And so through the mainstream press, that kind of eked out. Whereas in the black press, as we've seen through the polls, for the most part, African Americans thought that this man may have been innocent. So I think that for the most part, the African American press has decided to look more at the possibility of a reasonable doubt, and that is what has happened.
Let me suggest an alternative point of view to you, and that is that there is such a racial divide in this country today. Howard, I know you have written on at least one occasion about if you look at the top 20 television programs in this country, and then you look at the top 20 programs that are watched by African Americans, do you know there is only, I believe I'm correct on this, there is only one crossover program, and you know what that is? Monday Night Football. It is the only program that both blacks in this country and whites in this country regard as one of their favorite programs. And I think that's simply symbolic of the fact that on so many issues, blacks and whites come from a totally different perspective. And in some respects, I think what you're drawing attention to here is simply that the Simpson trial was one more instance, but a terribly visible instance, in which blacks and whites saw the same facts and came to totally different conclusions. Do you accept that?
And the key issue was the issue of reasonable doubt. I think for many white Americans, they cannot understand how African Americans could even perceive that there could be a reasonable doubt. I think that black folk saw reasonable doubt based upon a history, an experience of seeing racist cops convict, plant evidence on black folks who we know in our lives. And therefore, in the Simpson case, we thought that there was a possibility that a man like Mark Fuhrman could have been a part of a more complex conspiracy to convict this man named OJ Simpson, and that was enough for us to be reasonable doubt based upon our own cultural experience. And so when you see the split-screened situation with black folk on one side and white folk on one side, when the O.J. Simpson verdict was announced, the black folks screamed and celebrated because they had seen instances in their own lives and our own lives where people that we know had evidence planted upon them and other instances of injustice in terms of Constitution.
But that's not, if you'll forgive me, and maybe I'm misunderstanding you, that's not a media issue. That's a cultural issue. That is an issue of years of experience in the black community that says, yeah, I've seen that kind of thing happen to my neighbor's son, my neighbor's husband. Therefore, I do not find it as difficult to understand as a white audience might.
But it becomes a media issue when those people in the media making choices about how the news is presented.
Exactly.
How the news is presented are presenting news through their own cultural prism.
Right.
So it is really, in my perspective, definitely a media.
Fair point. Let me just turn over here. Hold on a second. I'm a little bit lost. Ed Gordon of Black Entertainment. Where are you, Mr. Gordon?
I'm in Mr. Gordon's seat, but I'm Ken Thomas, the publisher of the Los Angeles Sentinel newspaper.
Well, go ahead then.
And I have some comments I'd like to make. I believe that the frustrations that we're now experiencing, the attitudes that we're now experiencing, result from frustrated expectations. And those frustrated expectations came from the media hype and the misinterpretations of the evidence that were present, particularly from the eye of the camera, as Mr. O.J. Simpson gave an example last night of a particular instance where he believed that the evidence was misinterpreted. I think that misinterpretation and that media hype of the evidence is what is now causing our present problem with regard to the acceptance of the verdict and the overt attitudes that we've experienced. I believe media coverage has been slanted from the get-go. In the first place, there are not only two families that were involved in this tragedy, but three. Now, all I've heard of up until the verdict was the two families, and I sympathize them with all my heart and soul. And I'm very, very sympathetic towards the victims, and whoever the killers were, I hope they are caught and done with as the justice system should do. But O.J. Simpson himself, given the circumstances that we're in today, was also, although he's not dead, and I understand there's no comparison, he was a victim. He was in jail for a year. He had the charge of murder hanging over his head for a year. He was deprived of his liberty for a year. And now, even though the verdict is in, he's going to have this cloud of doubt hanging over him for the rest of his life.
No doubt about that. Go ahead if we can avoid getting into an argument about the case.
I know what you want to avoid. I must tell you, the saddest moment was when Ron and Nicole were murdered. The second saddest is the huge wedge that has been shoved between blacks and whites in this city and in this nation today. And it is hurtful to me, who had a son who couldn't see black and white if it slapped him in the face. Nicole, who probably, I'm sure, couldn't either. It is horrifying to me to see that this trial of two people that were brutally murdered has turned into the worst possible nightmare beyond that. For people to be fighting over the worst possible things that can divide any of us is terrible. There was a woman that I met today, and it's terrible that I have to refer to people in terms of their color, because I don't normally. This woman was a black woman who works at a company that I do business with. I walked into her office today. She stood, we embraced and kissed, and she cried because there is such a huge wedge between our city and our nation today, and it was in part caused by what occurred in this trial that was turned into a giant over the media on a day-to-day basis. I don't excuse anyone who is a racist. I find them disgusting. But the only way that we as people are going to ever get together is not use something like this as a wedge and talk about you're right or you're wrong, but find a way to come together And we're not going to do it by saying you're right and you're wrong.
I agree with you, Mr. Goldman, and I think that the media is primarily responsible for making that wedge.
If you would hold on just one second, I have to tell our affiliates out there that we're going to be going a little bit longer tonight so that we have an opportunity to get to a number of other people here who've been waiting very patiently. Karen Grigsby Bates.
I think that both Mr. Goldman and Mr. Thomas brought up something that I was hoping you would get to this evening, which is that media tends to make our communities monolithic, and that one of the things we looked at when we saw this split screen that your law student was referring to is that you saw all white people go, oh my God, this is a sad day for justice in America, and you saw all black people give what I call the thank you Jesus shot, the oh my God, you know, he's free. There were black people who were disgusted, who thought that Mr. Simpson was guilty. There were white people who said, he's innocent, I'm glad he's gone, but all we get are these shots of, you know, people of one color saying one thing, people of another color saying another thing, and it does exacerbate the situation. It makes white people angrier, it makes black people more defensive, and we have a choice when we decide to go to places to do these stand-ups, when we decide to go to places to do these interviews, kind of where we hang out, where we pick them, you know, where we pick up our opinions. We're not doing a very good job.
All right, I'd like to go around to a couple more people. All right, let me begin with A. Where is A? You're right up there. We haven't gone to you up there.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm a little short, so. I want to say that I definitely agree with Mr. Goldman, and I really feel that we should all become mirrors so we can finally see that the things that are happening today definitely affect our future. And we have the opportunity now to not dwell on this, but rather to learn and to grow from it. And I really believe that the media can be the catalyst to this.
All right, let's move around. Go ahead, sir.
My name is George Reedy. I covered the trial from day one, and I know many of the reporters here who was there also. I also broadcast over WDCU in Washington, D.C., doing it for the trial. The thing that I was part of the frenzy. I even investigated you, by the way. And the thing that really gets me was the fact...
What'd you find?
No. I won't go into that.
All right.
I'm the one who also caused one of the jurors to be kicked off, too, through my investigation. The thing that gets me is that while I was covering the trial, from day one, I saw how many of my colleagues voiced their opinions like the gentleman over there did. And in voicing their opinions of guilty from the very start of the trial, many of the reports that they sent out across America and around the world was based upon their thoughts. If you ask anyone, and many people have called me and said, what was my opinion about the trial? And I would say to them, what station did you watch? And they were commenting based upon the comments of analysts and reporters, not the comments of people who were for Rocket Harbor. They didn't comment, you know, Barry Shack comments. They commented on what reporters were saying. And many of these reporters, and like in this room here, have their biases. And from day one, and I can name their name, which I will not do, but many who brought their biases in their writing and in their reporting. And this has caused the split in America. This trial, and look, when I talk to DA people, half the DA believe that OJ was innocent and half believe that he was guilty. When I talk to cops, half the cops I spoke to believed he was innocent and some believe he was guilty. But what the bottom line is this, the problem that it's causing today on general Americans' jobs, this split has crossed all areas, and it can cause major problems. Let's face it, a few years ago, Boswell was a country that everyone got along in, they intermarried, there was no problem. Now they're killing each other over racial problems. I don't want that in my country. And my people been here long before white man even came over here on a boat. I don't want that in America. I don't want that in Los Angeles. You understand what I'm saying? I've been to war, as that gentleman has.
Right.
But my point to you is this, when you cover a story, stay neutral. Many reporters thought that I was many reporters called me, the mystery reporter, thought that I was pro-defense, and I was not. Some thought I was on Mr. Cochran's payroll. I was not. Never seen a man until this thing started.
Listen, you have just made an excellent point, and with your permission, I'm going to move on. The fundamental, I mean, if the point you're making is that the press has an obligation to remain objective while covering a story, but most especially while covering a trial, I don't think you're going to get any disagreement from any of the professional journalists here. It's an excellent point.
In the courtroom, I think the cameras should stay in the courtroom. What happened outside that courtroom, which I was also a part of. I was part of those frenzies, taking shots and everything, get hit upside the head with a camera, and pushing Barry Scheck to answer my question, and pushing Rocker to answer my question, and pushing Marshall, and pushing Dargan to answer my questions. We all did that. We all took part in that.
Let's move on. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Dominique Shelton, and I'm with the a coalition of African American attorneys here, Black women lawyers, California Association of Black Lawyers, National Bar Association, and all of us have been very disgusted and dismayed at the way the media has pandered to the most base and horrible preconceived notions about diverse juries, to African American attorneys, the words that have been used to describe the deliberations of the jury and their verdict from the time that the jury was first impaneled. Immediately there were presumptions that this jury could not be fair and reasonable because of their diversity. And from our standpoint, we find that very offensive. There's a presumption that because you have a diverse jury that they're not able to look at it, make reasoned decisions and make a decision based on the evidence. There's a presumption that they're motivated by emotion and race. I think those presumptions are in fact motivated by emotion and race, not the jurors. In addition, the words that have been used to describe a professional, Johnny Cochran, have been extremely insulting and offensive. Instead of praising him for his excellent lawyering, what we hear is low, slick, slimy. Those are the terms that are being used, and they pander to the, we have to be very responsible. I think the media has been very irresponsible because what they have done is taken stereotypes of what African American professionals are, what a diverse jury could be, and gone with it and basically fed this frenzy. And I think that's why we have millions of viewers that focused on this issue.
Let me just address a couple of questions to you, if I may. First of all, where did you hear or read low, slick, or slimy?
I read that in the Los Angeles Times, directly following Mr. Cochran's closing statement. What he was called was low, slick.
By whom?
By the reporter.
Oh, I doubt that.
Yes.
I really do, but
that was the term.
One of us.
That was the Los Angeles Times.
One of us will turn out to be right on that.
I
He may
believe
have
it was
been
Howard
quoting
Rosenberg right here in this panel. In addition.
Well, we can resolve that one very quickly. But the other question that I wanted to ask you was. Because I find it very difficult to believe that if I may just answer the lady's question, she just said, why don't I want to believe it? The reason I don't want to believe it, it's not a question of not wanting to believe it. The reason I don't believe it is because any reporter who would write that as his own opinion, I mean, it's one thing if he's quoting someone else. For a newspaper like the Los Angeles Times, I think would be out on his or her behind the next day.
Those terms have become the order of the day. Those terms have become the order of the day, as opposed to, I'm sure, Ted, that you've heard the term slick applied to Johnny Cochran, you've heard the term low, and you've heard the term disgusting by not only reporters, but other people who have taken advantage of the media. We find this, as African American attorneys, outrageous, and we've been very dismayed. And this isn't just started in the wake of the verdict. This started at the beginning of the trial. This was how the defense's work was being characterized. This was how the jury was being characterized. And I think that everybody in this room has to take some responsibility. Those of you who are in the media, take some responsibility for the lack of respect for the verdict that we have now, because throughout these proceedings there has been a systematic effort by the media to discredit the ability of this jury to be fair, to discredit the defense team, and we found it's been very disappointing for all of us here to watch in silence how this matter has been handled and how irresponsibly the printed media, and I agree with the gentleman across the room who said there's really no difference between the printed media, the television media, and the radio media with respect to this issue, because when it came to race, all of them were irresponsible.
All right, ma'am, I thank you. One more comment from the gentleman over here, and then we're going to have to start wrapping this up.
My name is Jerry Rubin, director of the Los Angeles Alliance for Survival Peace Organization. First of all, I'd like to say my heart goes out to the Goldman family, the Brown family, and the Simpson family. I personally think it was good that the media was in the courtroom, and by and large, the media has did a good job covering this trial. I know I've learned a lot in the past year. I'm sure everyone realizes now the importance of ending domestic violence and ending racism in all of our institutions in America. But it's then one other important thing. It brought us together, and as polarized as we are right now, and we're shouting at each other. At least we have the opportunity now to talk honestly with each other, and maybe things will progress now. Not talking at each other, but with each other, thanks to the media in part.
That is certainly a lovely sentiment, and let me be smart enough to take a nice sentiment when I hear it and use it as an opportunity to start to close this program down. Thank you very much. We're going to be back in just a moment. It is time to wrap up this special edition of Nightline, this viewpoint program of ours, and I would like to do it by turning again to the two attorneys whom I addressed at the beginning of this program. Mr. Scheck, if you would like to give us a closing thought or two, and then we'll go to Mr. Harmon.
Well, I was very moved by what Mr. Goldman said about the issue of race and its legacy in this case. And I just hope there are lessons we can learn from the Simpson case. When you get involved in it, sometimes it's very hard to find good lessons from it. One of them that I really think I should comment on before we close is this notion of rich man's justice. It's very troubling sometimes to hear people say that here's all these, defense lawyers that were able to put on a concentrated examination of particularly the scientific evidence in this case and the testimony of the police officers, and that poor people won't get that kind of representation. I think that is true. And the solution to that is to put more resources into the criminal justice system, into independent science and criminalistic laboratories, to do something to fix this system and to right the racial imbalance in the system. And hopefully that's one lesson that will come out of this.
Rockne Harmon?
Do I have time left?
You do.
To focus on the issue that we've been talking about, I think all the responsible journalists really need to listen to what they said tonight and realize that many trial judges do have a right to keep them out of the courtroom, and that when they express their interest in covering these things, it's not an absolute right. And there are some painful experiences that we've learned from this case, and those experiences are fresh in the minds of judges. And I think with the prevailing mood now and how it's provoked even here, what I feel is very palpable racial tension. I don't think that the courtrooms are going to be seeing cameras in there for the immediate future.
I would like to thank all of you here for being so patient and for your contributions to this discussion. It was very gracious of you all to come. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Los Angeles. For all of us here at ABC News, good night and thank you.